So we're going to go over Thomas Malthus and the idea of overpopulation. Thomas Malthus lived in the late 1700s during the Industrial Revolution, and he wrote an essay called An Essay on the Principles of Population. And to understand where Malthus was coming from, you have to picture a world um, in which there are giant tenement homes or slums being built for people to work in factories. There are poorhouses where people lived and died in when they couldn't pay their bills. That there were poor children living in the streets. If you've seen any movies or read any books that took place in the late 1700s, early 1800s, within like the city of London, um, it's that kind of world. It's kind of the world where in A Christmas Carol, like Tiny Tim is dying, right? And Malthus, you might have heard about in science class because Charles Darwin used his idea of if population grew exponentially and food growth grew arithmetically, that we would run out of resources. And so there were limits, there were checks and balances on population growth. And so Charles Darwin also read his essays, him and Charles Lyell, the geologist, to kind of help form his theory of natural selection. So when Thomas Malthus was looking around, what he could see was his population was booming, right? England was in a stage 2 of the demographic transition model. So the death rate had declined, but the birth rate was still really, really high, and their population was growing exponentially. And so he saw that if the population continued to grow this way, they would run out of food. But they couldn't grow as much food as they were, growing people, essentially. Many people at the time thought that his beliefs were too pessimistic, but he believed that there was a crisis point in which the world would exceed its ability to produce enough food to feed itself, and you can see that on the graph on page 178 in your reading. Many geographers today considered his beliefs to be too pessimistic, and his theory was based on a world supply of resources that were fixed rather than expanding. And he was again looking at food resources. And today, many people agree that population increase is not necessarily the problem. And so we do have a food shortage, a global food shortage. And there are a great number of people who are not necessarily starving to death, but they are dying from diseases, chronic malnutrition. And that most of these people, we technically grow enough food to sustain the entire world. But the problem is more of distribution and having infrastructure in place to give this food. And so what we really need is to grow more resources, develop more resources to supply food to this population. And lots of people think that a growing population isn't really a problem, that larger populations can stimulate economic growth and therefore the production of even more food. So Thomas Malthus was wrong. We did not reach a tipping point with running out of food. Food production actually increased over the last 50 years faster than Malthus predicted. He thought the world population would quadruple over the next 50 years. Our population has grown really fast, but it hasn't. The growth rate has stabilized. And even if you look at India, which has one of the fastest population growth rates in at least the 20th century, the population growth did not outpace food production. So what happened? Well, population growth started to slow down a little bit. It started to stabilize, but also we had another agricultural revolution. And there are 3 agricultural revolutions. So you might have heard about the first agricultural revolution, which took place 10 to 12,000 years ago, and that was when we domesticated, plants and animals and started to grow things like wheat in Mesopotamia, or corn in South and Central America, or rice in East Asia. And so that was the first agricultural revolution, the beginning of agriculture. The second agricultural revolution took place basically at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, but just like a slight lag. So the Industrial Revolution would have started in the mid-1700s. This agricultural revolution started in the early 1800s, so it kind of just lagged a little bit. So as they were developing things like steam engines and machines for factories, they also started to develop new farming technology. So first for the steam engine, we had the train and we had the steam engine for the boats, but eventually we had tractors. We came up with new ways of fertilizing food. We came up with ways as we were building factories. First it was in the textile industry, And then we started to do things like canned or tinned food, which was new. So the second agricultural revolution started in the early 1800s. And it really meant that now we were able to grow and store even more food than ever. And this was followed by the third agricultural revolution, or the Green Revolution, which started in about the 1950s. And this was the better living through chemistry revolution. So an increased number of pesticides to limit, insects and fungi and other diseases that were killing crops, and then an increased amount of fertilizer. Keep in mind the Green Revolution does not have anything to do with genetically modified organisms or even really genetically, I wouldn't say even like new hybrids. Like we did come up with new hybrids in the 50s. We did come up with new hybrids here. But the biggest push was these pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation. Today we have what might be considered eventually the genetic revolution, and that would be brand new. But do not confuse genetic breeding or GMOs with any of these past revolutions. And so here you can see in India, here's the population growing. And it's growing at a slight, not quite a J curve, but it's growing pretty fast. But you can see that they still were able to increase their growth of rice and wheat even faster than their population growth. We have neo-Malthusians today, and these are people who warned that a Malthusian crisis could still happen. People like Robert Ehrlich, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And they look at sustainability. Like how many people can the world sustain? And so the new prediction is like, what happens after the world reaches 10 billion people? Can we sustain more than 10 billion people on this planet? Already we have a lot of ecological problems, a great deal of soil erosion, water contamination, water shortages, soil salinization from the agricultural practices we already have in place. So can we keep it up if we had another 2 billion people on the planet? We don't know. In addition to wondering if we are sustainable, is we have an increase in per capita demand. So we want more stuff. We are all using more stuff. And as countries, these newly industrialized countries come into more and more wealth, they also want to live a life where they have access to air conditioning and, more gas in their cars and bigger cars and more clothes and giant washing machines. And so we use tons of stuff. In the first world countries, we use about 8 times the amount of materials that they do in a newly industrialized country. And so can we keep up with population growth if these newly industrialized countries with their rapidly growing populations begin to use as much stuff as we do? And then do we even have the right to mention, like, hey, you can't use that much stuff? Because we have been for many years. And then the other problem is natural resource depletion. And so Malthus was looking at food. But today, when we're looking at a giant crisis, like if you watch any kind of like dystopian future, we see some trends, right? So what happens if we run out of water? We have increased drought, our drinking water is bad, we can't drink it. What if we have too much water, rising sea levels and floods? What happens if could you imagine the crisis that would happen if we ran out of oil or fossil fuels? And so we have a lot of resources that are not, our use is not sustainable for them right now. And are we truly trying to come up with reasonable substitutes? Are we really developing like workable substitutes in the meantime? The answer is no, we're not. And so neo-Malthusians are worried about population growth outstripping our non-renewable resources and our renewable resources, but outside of food. So things like fossil fuels, soil, clean water. And right now, we don't know. There could be a Malthusian type of crisis. We really don't know. But what I can tell you, historically, population growth is slowing down. Globally, our population growth is slowing down. That a population of humans does not grow exponentially for long. It tends to taper out for different cultural reasons. So there's a lot to be grim about, but I don't know if a Malthusian crisis is one of them. So right here, this is that J curve, right? Exponential growth. We are growing really fast. It looks like a J. And then here we get again to that carrying capacity. And usually populations, when they grow too much, they kind of start to balance out. And so human population has been growing exponentially. It's been growing like this, like this, like this, and it's still growing exponentially now, but it's starting to slow down a little. So it hopefully will turn into that S curve, or that logistic growth, where we'll start to live at a level which we can sustain our population.